Hey, AfroTech Conference, thank you for having me here today. My name is Tariq Mahmoud. I'm Reddit's head of international. I'm here to talk about building an international expansion strategy that puts culture first. There's four main things I wanted to talk about. Why is this even important for us as employees, as employers? What's the strategic framework in terms of thinking about the things that matter to us? How do we apply it in the real world, giving an actual case example? And then talking more specifically about why this matters so much to us from a cultural point of view. First thing is that the world is super interconnected. There's major differences between countries, and those differences continue to be both substantial, complex, and complicated. And we can't ignore that interconnected globalization play at scale, and the value of reaching new audiences and immersing ourselves in new cultures are immensely important for us as companies. Every single successful company in the world has gone through a stage where they've expanded from their HQ location into net new markets. And for us to do that as employees or employers, there's a whole set of both positives and negative things we need to think about in terms of identifying which countries we should pursue first, how do we pursue it, and then how do we think about culture in terms of that overall strategic framework. So in terms of the opportunities, there's a few things written down here. The first is around adding volume and growth. And this is probably one of the most important things. By definition, by expanding into net new countries, you're adding an entire customer user base that didn't exist in your HQ location. So you're adding volume because you're getting new customers, new users, new subscribers, whatever might be the case for your specific company. And that volume increases in the equation of economic value equaling volume times margin. Volume is probably one of the easiest, or at least most direct things that you could control by expanding internationally. And the other thing to keep in mind is that incremental value mostly is positive, but it could also be negative, right? And so if you think about things that are in short supply, you actually increase the unit costs in the first step of internationalizing and adding more volume. So you have to think about where you are in the supply chain for this specific piece. The second thing is in decreasing costs, right? There's a few different ways you could decrease costs by internationalizing. It could be decreased labor costs, R&D costs, marketing, G&A, whatever might be the case. But those decreasing costs ultimately impact your economic value, obviously, because the margin is higher as a result. The third piece is around differentiating willingness to pay. And this is either on increasing willingness to pay at a unit margin. So in other words, the actual dollar that a user is willing to buy your product for, or increasing the overall volume of more users buying more products and therefore more revenue attributed overall. Keep in mind, revenue equals price times quantity, right? But I think the important here is don't confuse willingness to pay with how much with prices paid, right? So prices paid is a measure of industry attractiveness and bargaining power of a customer. Willingness to pay is about what something could be worth to a user. And so you want to be able to increase that through internationalizing. And you always want to think about the different segments that apply to different consumers. The fourth piece is around improving industry attractiveness. So you want to think about this in the context of leverage, PR, marketing, financial value. So your company as a financial value in terms of market capitalization, your multiples might be different for a US user versus a non-US user. Or by US, I'm using that in the context of where your HQ is located in. So that industry attractiveness piece, you could improve and increase your attractiveness as a company by purely growing globally, because from a PR, marketing, and financial valuation cap point of view, is all great and positive. The next piece is around normalizing risk. And so every single every single country has different risk profiles. You want to think about mitigating your risk in terms of focusing on mature countries, emerging countries, which have high risk, high reward, or something in the middle. But thinking about your sort of in the same context of your stock portfolio, you want to have risk profiles that are different across your entire portfolio. You want to have risk profiles that are different across your country portfolios as well. And then the last one is around generating knowledge. This could be around R&D increasing. This could be about local labor, staffing, and talent increasing your knowledge capture as a result. But I think the really important thing here to keep in mind is you don't want to double count different elements of this, right? If you're hiring a lot of engineering talent somewhere, that is either talent or that is either R&D, but you don't want to add those two together and sort of end up being double counting. So these are, 6 opportunities for you to think about in the context of adding. The second framework is around challenges. This one's a little easier to sort of conceptualize. The first is around cultural distance, right? And so when you think about the distance of your HQ versus a potential set of countries, there are HR, people-related issues, different languages, different ethnicities, different cultural norms, different religions. But keep in mind that not all distances are bad. Some are actually great. Diversity of experiences is obviously super, super important for you to capture, but you just need to factor this into your sort of operating model. The second piece is around administrative differences. This is probably the most important, at least in my mind, but it's differences around doing business, around judicial process indices, lack of common currency. So you're thinking about FX fluctuations, FX being, foreign exchange rate fluctuations, political hostilities. So thinking about big macro effects. The third is around geographic distances, right? Literal physical differences, but then also issues around land and border, sort of water access issues, time zone issues, distances, and then climate and health environments as well. And then finally, economic distances. Probably in my mind, the second most important thing here, but you want to think about macro and micro issues. So GDP differences, natural resources, financial resources, capital availability in a specific country, and obviously HR related things as well here in terms of labor costs and labor talent pools. So when you think about your challenges, I've mentioned the opportunities in the adding framework. Here are the challenges that add up to the CAGE framework. When you subtract those two things from each other, you get this risk-adjusted value that you could literally numerically assign to a list of countries, right? So a list of countries in the end could give you a score, a quantitative numerical score, if you assign different weights to all the things that I just mentioned, that gives you a risk-adjusted value for each single country that you are considering expanding into. And what that means in a real life case example, these are random numbers, sort of random metrics that I've picked here in the context of a digital media company. But you could apply this framework to any single company that you're thinking about, right? On the left-hand side, you have market score. You can think about this as adding. On the right-hand side, you have success score. You can think about this as sort of CAGE, but it's actually the inverse of CAGE, right? So success score is, CAGE is like negative things, but success score is the inverse of those negative things. But on the left-hand side, there's things like current user potential, user growth, industry digital ad spend, the growth of that ad spend, social media users, internet population, whatever might be the case. And then you assign weights, your own weights on top of each of these numerical numbers. And on the right-hand side, similarly, I mentioned doing business indexes. These are things that come from UN and other sort of third-party resources, language diversity, geodistance. I mentioned geodistance already. And you also assign weights. This gives you a number in the end, and you could say, I care more about market score and less about success score because I want high risk, high reward, right? Like I'm willing to take on more risk if I could achieve greater opportunity on the market side. Right. So think about this in the context of your company, customize it, and then you can leverage that for how you think about which countries to select. But probably the most important thing here to think about is that none of this is possible. You can have the best strategy in the world, but execution is driven by culture and it's driven by people. It's not driven by your terms and your frameworks and your Excel spreadsheets. There's 5 things I want you to keep in mind. The first is around the time and speed to execute is purely driven by your people. So your culture and not your strategy. The second is the passion and the buy-in of employees. You need to have a strong culture for people to believe in your opportunity ahead of you because it's hard, it's complicated. It's not easy to internationalize and grow outside your HQ. The third is around your ability to pivot as new information is gathered, right? And so for companies to be able to have people do this on their own without being told what to do is better than having the best strategy in place in the beginning, which might ultimately change. Fourth is around managing remote people. So this is around time zone issues, cultural issues, languages, hiring, et cetera. And then the fifth is around culture of risk tolerance. The totally different levels of comfortability with taking risks depending on the people that you have. And you want to be able to have a strong culture to be able to manage those things. So again, time, retention and buy-in of employees, ability to pivot, managing remote people, and having a high culture of risk to take advantage of these opportunities. In the end, the thing to keep in mind is that strategy identifies choices and direction, but culture ultimately delivers on it. So hopefully that was all helpful for you all. We talked about why this matters. We talked about the framework and we talked about applying it to reality. But keep in mind, the most important thing is the cultural element that ultimately gets you to execution. Thank you for your time. Hope to have conversations around question and answer. Feel free to reach out and we'll make sure to have this be helpful for you all. Thank you.